He stepped into the grand ballroom wearing a light beige t-shirt and black jeans that had clearly seen better days. His sneakers were scuffed, and his hands bore the quiet signs of manual labor, dry, calloused, and strong. But it wasn't the dirt under his nails that caught people's attention. It was the fact that he didn't belong. Not here. Not at the Langford Heritage Arts Gala. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm golden hue across the polished floors. Waiters in tuxedos moved gracefully with trays of champagne. Music patrons and donors in silk gowns and designer suits laughed softly, trading anecdotes and investment tips. Everyone had a name tag. Everyone had a title. Everyone knew the code, except him. He was just there to help set up the stage, a last-minute request. Someone on the staff got sick, and a friend had called him in. Just a few hours, move some chairs, stay out of the way. That was the plan, until she noticed him. Standing near the grand piano, Beatrice Langley, the chair of the entire foundation and queen of social politics, raised her manicured hand and gestured toward him. Her silver hair was swept back into a perfect low bun, her green silk shawl draped with effortless elegance across her shoulders. She looked at him like one might look at a misplaced object. "You there," she called, her voice slicing through the soft chatter. "Yes, you. Why don't you give us a little entertainment?" Conversations paused. He glanced around, confused. Her smile was wide, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Come on," she insisted, gesturing to the Bosendorfer piano behind her. "We've been listening to rehearsed perfection all morning. Let's try something authentic." A few guests laughed, just enough to let him know this wasn't a request. It was a joke. "A test? I'm not—" he began, but she cut him off with a raised eyebrow. "It's just for fun," she said sweetly. "We won't judge." Much. More laughter. The pianist scheduled to perform later, a young man named Trevor Hale, leaned against the wall, smirking. "Better not scratch the ivory, buddy." A server passing by whispered, "Ignore her. You don't have to do anything." But he didn't walk away. He looked at the piano, then at Beatrice, then at the dozens of faces watching him now. Not with curiosity, but with anticipation. They were expecting embarrassment. A few wrong notes, a laugh, a story to tell over dessert. He took a breath and walked toward the piano. With every step, the room grew quieter. He pulled out the bench, sat down slowly, placed his hands on the keys. Beatrice tilted her head with amusement. She had no idea that in the next 5 minutes, this simple man would tear down every assumption they had ever made about him. He didn't know yet that today would change everything. He was calm, still, almost too still. His hands rested lightly on the keys, his fingers barely curled over the polished surface. For a moment, no one breathed, no one moved. The ballroom that had buzzed with chatter and champagne now hung in the tension of something unexpected. He didn't look like a pianist. He didn't carry the air of an artist or the arrogance of a performer. But the way he sat, steady, grounded, without fear or hurry, it said something else. It said he belonged. And then the first notes emerged, soft, barely audible, a whisper of melody that floated through the room like smoke from a candle just blown out. And just like that, everything changed. Heads turned, phones were lowered. The laughter stopped because what he played wasn't random. It wasn't fumbling. It was deliberate, delicate, devastating. And what no one knew, not Beatrice, not Trevor, not any of the donors or sponsors, was that this man had spent his entire life behind the music. His name was Caleb Monroe, and long before he wore that faded t-shirt and carried folding chairs for pocket money, Caleb had been something else entirely. Not a celebrity, not a name you'd recognize from magazines, but a force, a builder, a quiet storm. Caleb was the founder and heartbeat behind the Horizon Sound Project, a nonprofit that offered free music education and therapy to children in underserved communities. It started in a borrowed church basement with a single keyboard he bought used for $90. Now, it operated in 12 cities across the country. What he created wasn't just music, it was survival. He knew what silence could do to a child, not the peaceful kind, but the silence that follows grief, poverty, abandonment. The silence of a home with no laughter, of a school with no art class, of a childhood where dreams get shelved before they ever begin. That's the silence Caleb fought against. one note at a time, one story at a time. And he didn't build Horizon because it was a business idea. He built it because he had been that child. At 9, he had lost his mother. At 10, he had stopped speaking to anyone. At 11, he found an old upright piano in the back of a community center. It didn't play perfectly, neither did he, but it made sound, and the sound made space. And in that space, he found his voice again. He wasn't just teaching kids how to play scales, he was teaching them how to feel again, to breathe again, to belong again. Horizon had helped a boy named Jalen, who hadn't spoken a word since his father was killed. 6 months after starting music sessions, Jalen wrote and performed his first original piece, on stage, in front of his whole school. It had helped Marisol, a teenage girl with cerebral palsy, who discovered that she could compose entire orchestral arrangements using adaptive technology, and now mentors others with mobility challenges. Caleb never sought recognition. He avoided cameras, turned down press. He wasn't interested in applause. He believed that the greatest music was the kind that never needed to be heard by the world, just by the person who needed it most. He wore the same shoes he'd owned for 6 years. He lived in a modest apartment above a laundromat. He gave almost everything he earned back into the program. And every week, without fail, he'd volunteer at Horizon's local branches, cleaning floors, replacing strings, helping parents fill out financial aid forms. People didn't recognize him because that's how he wanted it. Until today. Until this exact moment, when Beatrice Langley tried to turn him into a joke. And now, note by note, truth was unfolding in the middle of that golden ballroom. But what came next would leave them stunned, because Caleb's story wasn't just music. It was legacy, and no one there was ready for the weight of it. Caleb didn't play to impress. He didn't need to. Every note he struck came from a place so deep, so honest, that even those who knew nothing about music felt something shift inside them. It was a language that bypassed words, melted pride, and exposed the fragile places we try to hide. At the far end of the ballroom, Harold Prescott, a seasoned philanthropist who had funded orchestras across Europe, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. His wife, Margaret Prescott, sat beside him, frozen mid-sip of her mimosa. They weren't music critics, but they had been around enough brilliance to recognize when they were witnessing something rare. Beatrice Langley, meanwhile, stood in silence, her champagne untouched. The smug amusement that once played across her face was gone, replaced by an emotion she hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. She had orchestrated this moment to entertain, to amuse, but instead she had unlocked something sacred. Caleb didn't look up. He didn't bask. He didn't break character. He played as if no one was there, as if the entire room had fallen away, and it was just him and the memory of sound, because to him, music wasn't performance, it was restoration. It was the same piano he used to play for his little sister Samantha, back when they still lived in that one-bedroom apartment with leaky pipes and no heating. She used to sit on a stool beside him with a coloring book in her lap, humming softly as he practiced. Samantha had been the first person he ever taught. She had also been the first person he ever lost. After her death, Caleb had nearly quit music altogether. For months, he couldn't touch the keys. The silence returned, louder than ever, until a young boy, barely 7, walked into one of Horizon's early workshops. His name was Elias. He wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't speak. But when Caleb placed his hands gently over Elias's and helped him press down a chord, the boy smiled. It saved him. Not just Elias, Caleb too. That's when he realized it wasn't about concerts or competition. It was about connection. Today, Horizon had over 300 volunteers, a full-time team of 22, partnerships with hospitals, refugee centers, foster programs, and no one in that room had heard of it, because Caleb had never asked for applause. He had only ever asked for one thing: for people to look beyond the surface, but no one ever had, until now. The young man standing at the side of the ballroom, watching Caleb with awe, was Julian Rivers, a graduate of Horizon himself and now a teacher at one of their partner schools. He had once lived in a shelter. Now, he led string ensembles in after-school programs across 3 neighborhoods, and at the table nearest the piano, a young girl named Grace, age 11, sat beside her adoptive parents, She had been through 5 foster homes before finding Horizon. Through music, she had found more than rhythm. She had found a voice. Grace was the reason they were even at the gala that day. Her parents had been invited as guests of honor for their support of community music programs, but no one had told them that the man playing was the one who had saved their daughter's life, because Caleb never mentioned it. He never talked about what he had done. He just did it. The final note lingered. He lifted his hands slowly, allowing the silence to settle like snowfall. No applause. Not yet. Only stillness. And then, somewhere in the back, a single clap. Then another, and another, until the entire room, every donor, every patron, every polished elite, rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried, but all of them felt it. They had misjudged him, and they weren't ready for what was coming next. The applause faded slowly, but the silence that followed was even louder. Caleb stood from the bench without a word. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stepped back, letting the moment belong to the music, not to himself. People stared, not with pity, not with confusion, but with a dawning sense of shame and awe. It was Julian Rivers who stepped forward first, his voice shaking slightly. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the crowd. "I don't think everyone here knows who that is." Beatrice, who had remained standing, motionless, glass in hand, turned slowly. Julian looked at Caleb, then back at the audience. "That man," he continued, "is the reason I'm alive, and not just me. Hundreds of us." A murmur rippled through the room. Julian took a deep breath. "His name is Caleb Monroe. He's the founder of the Horizon Sound Project." Someone near the back whispered, "Wait, Horizon? The non-profit?" A woman gasped, "The program that partners with children's hospitals?" Another donor spoke up, "My nephew was in that. He couldn't speak after the accident, but after 6 months of music therapy, he started talking again," Caleb said softly, finishing the sentence for her. All eyes turned back to him. He hadn't planned to speak. He never did. But in that moment he felt something stir. Not pride, not vindication. Something more important. Truth. "I wasn't trying to perform," he said, his voice calm but clear. "I was just doing what I've always done, use music to tell the truth." Beatrice's grip on her champagne flute tightened. The man she'd called out, mocked in front of her elite guests, was suddenly not just someone, but someone powerful. Someone real. Someone who had done more with old instruments and borrowed spaces than most of them had done with all their endowments combined. "Why didn't you say who you were?" someone asked from the crowd. Caleb looked at them, kindly, not defensively. "Because I wanted to listen before I spoke. And sometimes, when people see your shoes, they stop hearing your voice." The room quieted. Trevor Hale, the gala's original performer, shifted uncomfortably in his place. His arms were still crossed, but now they pressed against his chest, like a shield. Beatrice finally spoke. "Well," she said, clearing her throat. "Mr. Monroe, that was unexpected." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "You could say the same about how I was invited to play. The words weren't harsh, but they didn't have to be. They hit harder than any accusation, because they were. True?" Julian stepped beside Caleb now, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "If you hadn't played," he said, turning back to the crowd, "none of you would have ever known. And maybe that's the problem." The audience stood still, not out of discomfort, but reflection. Someone clapped again, and then someone else, until the entire room, for the second time in one morning, gave the same man a standing ovation. This time, not for his talent, but for his character. Beatrice, still standing, forced a smile. "We should continue with the program," she said. But no one sat down, because the program had already changed, and it had nothing to do with sheet music. Beatrice Langley had never lost control of a room before. Not once in her 30 years hosting galas, curating guest lists, and deciding who was worthy of the spotlight. But now, it was no longer her room. She looked around and saw something she wasn't used to. Faces turned away from her, not toward her. Conversations she couldn't hear. People she didn't control. And at the center of it all stood a man she had once called, "You there." Caleb Monroe didn't gloat. He didn't rub anything in. He simply stood among them, completely unchanged, yet entirely redefined. That made it worse. "Mr. Monroe?" said a voice from near the stage. It was Margaret Prescott who had been silently observing. "If I may ask, why do we know so little? About you? You've built something extraordinary." Caleb gave a small smile. "Because extraordinary things aren't always loud." There was a pause. Then Harold Prescott cleared his throat. "I'd like to formally recommend Horizon for this year's Humanity Through Arts grant." Beatrice turned sharply. "That grant requires a formal application." Harold raised a hand. "Yes, and I believe we can waive protocol given the circumstances. After all, it's intended for projects that change lives." Whispers of agreement moved through the room. Beatrice's control continued to slip. Then came the next blow. Julian Rivers, still at Caleb's side, opened the envelope he'd brought with him. A donation form. "I brought this to contribute. Quietly today. But now, I think it deserves to be said out loud." He looked to the crowd. "I'm donating $50,000 to Horizon because I'm living proof that it works." Gasps, applause. Margaret stepped forward next. "Make that $100,000 from the Prescott family." More murmurs. Beatrice's smile grew tighter by the second. It was no longer a brunch. It was a movement. Trevor Hale, who had planned to play Liszt for the crowd, stood in the corner, watching. Everything crumbled around his prepared piece. No one asked him to go on stage. No one needed him to. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, Trevor realized talent without humility meant very little. Beatrice attempted to recover. "Well," she said, addressing the audience, "perhaps we can present all this as part of our diversity initiative. It reflects well on the foundation." The room went silent again. Then Caleb turned to her, slowly but without anger. "With all due respect," he said gently, "this wasn't about your initiative. This was about how you treated someone based on what they wore." Beatrice blinked. "And that," Caleb added, "is the lesson that should go on record." He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth had already done the heavy lifting. Near the doors, Grace's adoptive father, Matthew Harris, took out his phone and began recording. "People need to hear this," he said quietly to his wife. "Not just the music, the message." Across the room, Chloe Jensen, a journalist from the New York Chronicle who had attended the event simply for networking, stood still, her notepad now filled with quotes and observations she hadn't planned to capture. This wasn't a recital anymore. It was a reckoning. And yet, in the middle of all the shifting energy, Caleb remained grounded. He hadn't come to change minds. He'd come to move a piano bench. But sometimes, the most powerful changes come when you aren't trying to prove anything at all. The day after the gala, the Langford Foundation's office phone rang nonstop. Calls from journalists, calls from donors, calls from people who had never heard of Horizon Sound Project until now. Beatrice Langley sat in her office, the blinds half closed, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. An unread email blinked on her screen. Subject: resignation. Suggested: from Charles Whitmore, board president. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea, but even the porcelain cup seemed to judge her now. The video had gone viral overnight, not of Caleb playing, but of what happened after. His words, the crowd's reaction. The moment Julian had called out, "You're clapping because you saw his soul, not his shirt." Millions watched, millions shared. And for once, Beatrice was not in the spotlight. She was in the shadow of a story far greater than any gala she had ever curated. Across town, at a modest music center with cracked tiles and paper banners made by children, Caleb returned to work. He arrived early, as usual, unlocked the back door, set up folding chairs, tuned the donated instruments, brewed coffee for the parents who would come in later. He didn't speak about the gala. He didn't talk about what had changed, because for him, nothing had. He wasn't looking for fame. He was building futures, and yet change had come, whether he wanted it or not. A black SUV pulled up outside the center. From it stepped Richard Bennett, the director of arts and culture for the city. His assistant scrambled behind him, arms full of folders and gift bags. Caleb met them at the door. "Mr. Monroe," Richard began, offering his hand. "Your story, your work. It's exactly what this city needs more of." "I'm just trying to help kids find their sound," Caleb replied. "And you've done more than that. You've reminded us what real leadership looks like." Inside, the students were arriving. Grace waved at Caleb and ran up to show him a new melody she had written. Jalen, now more confident, helped a younger boy carry his violin case. Richard glanced around the center, at the peeling paint, the broken heater, the outdated sound equipment. "This space is sacred," he said quietly, "and we want to help. Preserve it." He handed Caleb a folder. Inside, official grant approval, enough funding for 5 years, expansion, full renovations, salaries for full-time staff, and a new digital lab for composition. Caleb looked down at the papers, then back at his students. "This isn't for me," he said. "It's for them." Richard smiled. "We know." Meanwhile, back at the Langford Foundation, the board held a closed meeting, and for the first time in 2 decades, Beatrice Langley was not seated at the head of the table. In her place sat Margaret Prescott, temporary interim chair, with Julian Rivers seated to her right. "We're re-evaluating our outreach programs," Margaret began, "and our leadership structure." Beatrice cleared her throat. "With all due respect, I've dedicated my life to this institution." Margaret raised a hand. "Yes, and in doing so, you lost sight of why it exists in the first place." Beatrice went silent. Julian leaned forward. "We should never again allow someone's clothes or title to determine their worth in this organization." Everyone nodded. Change had begun. But Caleb didn't know about the meeting. He was too busy showing a young girl how to play arpeggios with one hand while holding a juice box with the other. Because real leaders don't lead from podiums. They lead from presence, from listening, from knowing that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you almost didn't notice. 2 weeks later, the city hosted its annual Voices of Tomorrow Arts Showcase at the historic Roland Theater, a marble landmark usually reserved for high society concerts, galas, and national performances. But this time, the spotlight had shifted. For the first time in the event's history, the opening performance wouldn't come from a celebrated soloist or international guest artist. It would come from Horizon Sound Project. And at the heart of it all was a man in a beige t-shirt and black jeans, still refusing to buy a new outfit. Backstage, Caleb Monroe tuned the last cello himself. He smiled gently at Grace, who stood nervously in a new dress donated by a local sponsor. "You don't need to be perfect," he said. "You just need to be true." Grace nodded, eyes wide. In the audience, rows of donors, city leaders, music critics, and families filled the grand theater. In the front row sat the Prescotts. Just behind them, Richard Bennett. A few seats away, even Trevor Hale, the original gala pianist, had come, now visibly humbled, dressed simply, and clapping for the kids. But most surprising of all, in the third row, trying not to be noticed, sat Beatrice Langley. She had not been invited, but she had come, not to be seen, but to understand. On stage, Julian stepped to the microphone. "Tonight's opening number," he said proudly, was written by a student who, just last year, was too afraid to speak in public. He turned toward Grace. "Now she speaks through music." The lights dimmed, the hall hushed, and then it began. A soft, trembling solo on the piano, played by Grace herself, slowly joined by violins, then cello, then voice, each layer building like breath, returning to lungs long deprived of air. The song wasn't perfect, but it was powerful. It was honest, and by the final note, the audience was on its feet. Tears, applause, not for technical skill, but for bravery. Caleb watched from the wings, his heart full, but his expression calm. He never stepped forward. He didn't take the mic. He just placed a hand over his chest. Once. That was enough. After the show, dozens lined up not for autographs, but for handshakes, for questions, for donations. The press captured the moment, but not the soul of it. That belonged to the kids, to the music, to Caleb. Later that night, as the theater lights dimmed and the hall emptied, Beatrice approached quietly from the aisle. She stopped a few feet away. "I was wrong," she said. Caleb looked up from the piano bench where he was helping Grace close the lid. "About what?" he asked softly. "About you. About everything." Caleb didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. "I thought this world was about polish," she said. "About presentation. But tonight, I saw what it's really about." He nodded once. "People," he said. "It's always been about people." She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and left. No defense, no grand gesture. Just a woman walking out of her own illusion, finally facing the truth. Outside, Caleb walked Grace and her parents to their car. The night air was crisp, the stars were out, and, somewhere behind them, the doors of the Roland Theater closed with a quiet thud, like the end of a chapter. But for Caleb, the story was just beginning. Not everyone who changes the world walks in wearing a suit. Sometimes it's the one in a faded shirt and quiet shoes, the one nobody notices, the one nobody expects. Caleb Monroe was never looking for attention. He never cared for the spotlight. And maybe that's exactly why his story matters more than most, because in a world that rewards noise, Caleb chose silence. In a culture obsessed with image, he chose substance. He didn't speak to be heard. He acted to make a difference. And somehow, that made the room quieter than any standing ovation ever could. This wasn't a story about music. It was a story about dignity, about value, about the danger of judging someone before you've even looked them in the eye. How many times have we mistaken humility for weakness? How often do we walk past janitors, delivery drivers, servers, never imagining the depth of their story? Maybe they've survived more than we'll ever know. Maybe they've built something remarkable, one unseen act of kindness at a time. Maybe they are exactly who we need to become. You see, what Caleb reminded us is that the real difference between people isn't wealth, it's perspective. And the moment we stop measuring others by their appearance, their paycheck, or their silence, we begin to see the world for what it is, a stage where the most powerful performances come not from those seeking applause, but from those playing for something greater. He was never trying to prove anything. He was just being who he's always been. And in the end, that was enough to change a room full of people who thought they already knew everything. Maybe you felt like Caleb at some point, underestimated, ignored, overlooked. If you have, this story is yours too. And if this message moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who deserves to be seen, or if it helped you look at the world a little differently, then join us, not for fame, not for likes, but because we believe in stories that teach, in storytelling that heals, in truth that humbles. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that awaken empathy, inspire change, and help us all become just a little more human, because we don't need more noise in the world. We need more meaning. And sometimes, it begins with a simple man at a piano, showing us all what we forgot to remember. Thank you for watching, and never forget, true respect begins where judgment ends.